We have two experts here. I am definitely not an expert on psychology, and a lot of you can, back me up on that claim. But so Martin Seif is a PhD, and he co-founded the Anxiety and Depression Association of America and was a member of its board of directors through 1977 through 1991. He is a faculty member of the New York Presbyterian Hospital, board certified in cognitive behavioral psychology. Oh my. That's a mouthful. From the American Board of Professional Psychology, and served as Associate Director of the Anxiety and Phobia Treatment Center at the White Plains Hospital from 1990 through 2016. He was creator and director of the Freedom to Fly, the nation's premier airport-based fear of flying program from 2000 through 2016. And he maintains a private practice in New York and Manhattan and Greenwich, Connecticut, and co-authored What Every Therapist Needs to Know About Anxiety Disorders, Overcoming Unwanted Intrusive Thoughts, and The Reassurance Trap. Wow, that's pretty impressive. And Dr. Stephen Rice is Associate Professor of Aviation Human Factors at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. He received his PhD in Aviation Human Factors from the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. He taught for 7 years at New Mexico State University and 3 years at Florida Institute of Technology, FIT, before moving to Embry-Riddle in 2016. His research interests include trust and automation for both manned and unmanned aerial vehicles. Well, I think we're probably spot on the topic with this gentleman with us today. For both manned and unmanned aerial vehicles, with a focus on consumer perceptions of autopilots in transportation. Well, getting back to my newspaper comment a few moments ago, I actually really think that's neat. He has published 115 papers in peer-reviewed journals and presented over 140 international conferences. Much of his work in aviation has been funded by the FAA, the U.S. Air Force, NATO, and the U.S. Army, amongst others. So the format for these presentations, I'm going to ask each gentleman to come up here and give a presentation. Hold your questions to the end. After they present, I'll start off with a few questions, then we'll let you ask some questions. I'm sure there are going to be a lot. This is a fascinating topic. So gentlemen, educate us, please. And do you want to come up here? Do you want to sit and talk? How would you like to do that? Great, okay, we'll do that. Yep, you're going to go first because you're the first one sitting closest to me.
Okay. How do you do? First of all, the most important thing. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great, okay. I was introduced very pleasantly by Ford, and I want to thank you all for inviting me to be here. I started a program about 20 years ago called Freedom to Fly, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it. It's for people who are afraid to fly. It's a group program, consists of 25 to 35 or 40 people. It involves 6 two-hour group meetings. People actually go through security. A lot of people in the group have never been through security. There's a pilot who comes and speaks to people at meetings 2 and 4, and the program consists of a lot of psychoeducation. It's a common term used today in the treatment of anxiety disorders, psychoeducation about fears, phobias, flight fright, and the principle behind that is that anxiety loves ignorance. Okay, the pilot spoke about sort of maintenance, training, whatever. We boarded a stationary plane after each meeting, and then after the 5th meeting, we took a round trip, commercial airline flight. This is based in the New York area. This was at Westchester Airport, and we went to Boston or DC after each meeting. By the way, those trips, I would have about 35 fearful flyers. I would have myself, usually the pilot, who spoke with us, and 4 assistants. And those flights were really intense, let's put it that way. Very, very intense. As a post note, I am really grateful to some of the flight attendants who did fabulous work on some of those flights, and I would hire them as therapists in an instant, really. Okay, we saw about 2,000 people. Okay. We also used luckily at the airport, the other side of the airport was with our private planes. We used a Redbird flight simulator, and I have to thank both TSA and JetBlue. JetBlue provided us with a stationary plane that people went on after each meeting. A lot of these people had never been or had not been on a plane. Most people had not been on a plane for over 5 years. And because we went through security, JetBlue provided us with a false boarding pass for each person, and TSA actually put these people through security. I want to be brief, so I'm not going to get into some of the, at least some of the individual instances that occurred during the 17 or 18 years of this. So what does it mean to say I'm afraid of flying? It's actually a misnomer, because it's not fear of flying, it's really fears of flying, because the flying experience is really a confluence of many different fears. The actual going on a plane and transporting oneself from point A to point B is, I think of as a perfect storm of particular anxiety sensitivities. There's a big question, how many people who are afraid of flying? And there's very little hard data, very, very little hard data. There is a meta-study that's sort of challenged, that goes over the variety of surveys that have been taken by Oakes and Bohr. I'm sorry, my academic background, I put that in. You don't have to follow those at all. Partly because the people who did the, who surveyed people really didn't understand the nature of fear of flying fears. So, and fear of flying is never included in some of the really good epidemiological studies. I don't know that you would have any reason to know this, but the epidemiological catchment area study and the national comorbidity study, these are large national good studies of sort of the rates of psychiatric disorders in the United States. Now, there are some whispers that perhaps only 50% of the people in the United States ever fly. Now, I don't know where that came from, but I've heard it sort of whispered from time to time. And if that's true, we don't know if that's economic, social, racial, cultural, but there are groups of people who, for whatever reason, never travel very far. And that has to be looked at in terms of potential additional revenue sources. The regular guesstimate is that 20% of people in the United States, and this has been shown cross-culturally pretty much, are fearful enough so that their fear of flying interferes with their regular flying. We're not going to get into details with that. Now, I am now preparing you for the next slide, which I apologize, it has a lot of information on it, but I want to go over it. So let's suppose I have a group of 100 people. And I say to people, okay, all of them are afraid of flying. And I say, what are you afraid of? And I write a list. And people yell up to me what it is that they're afraid of. And I'm going to start writing a list, okay? Now, I'm going to present you this list in the next slide. You understand that there are lots of people who have more than one fear. So of the 100 people, there are going to be far more than 100 fears. But let me just go over it and give you an idea of the sorts of things that trigger people off who say they're afraid of flying. If we go all the way on the left side, I don't fly because I'm afraid of the radiation. It's too high up and there isn't enough protection for me. The next one is I'm going to say bad things. Let me just comment on that. That's people who say, oh my goodness, what if I get on the plane and yell out, I'm a terrorist? What'll happen to me? Believe it or not, well, I won't get into it. The first and the second that I mentioned, those are more subtle forms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Some people are concerned that others will notice them. Their primary concern is that their discomfort will be noticed. These are people who are suffering from some form of social anxiety disorder. They want to disappear when they get frightened. Now, if we get into larger percentage of people, there are a lot of people who are afraid of getting sick on the flight. They don't like the heights, and they know exactly who they are. They tell me, I'd have no problem flying if we could just fly at treetop height, you know? Not too high, just right there, okay? Lots of people are afraid, there are people who are afraid of fights breaking out on the plane. Oh my goodness, what will I do? There's a lot of media about that. I put landing and I put a star after that because there are people, there's about a third of the people who are afraid of landing. They somehow have their mind, that's a really dangerous part of the flight, landing, okay? But I put a star there because there's a real break there. There's another group of people, probably about 50%, who just love it when the pilot says, okay, we're preparing for landing. And they go, oh, thank goodness, we're almost there. Okay. People are afraid of crashing. I mean, no one likes crashing, but that's what they will say as their primary fear of not, or one of their great fears. No one likes turbulence. No one likes turbulence, okay? And now we're getting to large percentages. People take takeoff. They don't like takeoff. They don't like the experience of it. Finally, they don't like being in an enclosed place, and they know who they are. They say, I have no problem flying if I could just open the windows and get some fresh air or something like that, you know. Okay. And finally, the majority of people are somehow afraid of panicking while being on the flight for whatever reasons. If you don't know what panicking is, you're lucky. But if you do know what a panic is, and my guess is in a group of people this size, you do know what it is, it's a very unpleasant experience, and they feel that they can't get away to safety. That clear? Let's go on. If we look at diagnoses, I'm sorry, these are my numbers. These are, you know, I'm a psychologist, a one-trick pony, and so we're looking at the sort of psychiatric diagnoses. The largest percentage of people who have some form of panic disorder. Panic disorder is defined as either panicking and fear of panicking again and avoiding things in some way because of the panic. The second is generalized anxiety disorder. This is a kind of worry disorder that involves a lot of physiological involvement. How are we doing with time? Got a few more minutes, okay. Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, which is a very complicated and interesting phenomenon we don't get into. Social anxiety. And the last one is specific phobia. That would be what people call aviophobia or claustrophobia. Very few people have specific aviophobia. That's a specific phobia. It's probably too technical to get into. I mean, but just to say that most people afraid of flying don't have aviophobia. They have some form of panic disorder. How do they cope with their fears? They talk to the flight crew, especially upon entering the plane. I put 2 stars there because what do you do if you have an autonomous plane? Most of them say they want some what I call empty reassurance. They say, hey, it's going to be a good flight. Pilot says, yeah, it'll be a great flight, terrific flight. Don't worry, it'll be great. Great, okay, and they feel reassured in some way. A lot of them say to themselves, hey, the pilot wants to live just as much as I do. So how do you deal with that with autonomous flying, okay? They fly wide body because they're somewhat claustrophobic. They upgrade their seats. There's a lot of avoidance, pills and alcohol. Ford talked about that. A lot of empty reassurance. Empty reassurance is reassurance that makes no sense, but it still feels good. Tell me I'm going to do well. Tell me it's going to be a safe flight. Sure, it's going to be a safe flight. Great, I feel better. Okay? Take shorter flights. I know people who fly to Europe in 2-hour segments. They count down to the end of flight. There are many rituals and many forms of checking. Okay? We're going to go on. Anxiety reduction, the active therapeutic ingredient is exposure. Has to be done the right way. Has to be willing. Can't tie someone up and put them on the plane. Has to be manageable. Can't be traumatic. If it's traumatic, then the person gets off the flight and says, you know what? It really is a good idea not to fly on planes, okay? I was right all along. And they have to avoid avoidances, which is the meat and potatoes of my business, okay? And the mechanisms of flying make exposure difficult because you have to plan the flight, buy the tickets, go through security, go to the airport, whatever. The biggest problem is anticipatory anxiety, which is thinking about how frightened you're going to be when you're on the plane. And it's a very persistent component, probably functions from a different part of the brain than the panic anxiety, mediated more by the prefrontal cortex than the amygdala, but we're not going to get into that. I just have 4 main points. Fear of flying is a confluence of many different fears. Fearful flyers use a combination of reassurances, avoidances, and distractions to cope with what I call flight fright. The biggest problem is anticipatory anxiety, and exposure is the active therapeutic ingredient in getting over it, which makes, and the flying experience makes that exposure difficult. Thank you.
Hey, Martin, I have one question for you.
Oh, no.
You know, for us simpletons in the audience, what is an epidemiological study?
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That word is a big word for some of us.
Epidemiology basically refers to the incidence, the number of people who have a disorder over their lifetime and the number of people who have the disorder at a particular time. There are words like incidence and prevalence, and epidemiology speaks to the statistical rates of people who have that particular disorder.
And one last question similar. What does the DSM-5 stand for?
Okay, so what happens in the Department of Psychiatry, what they do is they try to provide a standardized list of diagnoses of all known diagnostic disorders. And about 2 years ago, well, the DSM stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and I'm sure none of you ever see shrinks, but on your insurance, if you fill out insurance, there's a diagnostic code, and that's used to be DSM-5. Now it's been changed over to an international diagnostic code, but it's really the same thing. So DSM-5 really speaks to well-known and agreed upon diagnostic categories, okay? And you can actually use numbers to describe exactly what they are. I apologize for the psychobabble. You know, you do it so often you don't even realize you're talking it, really.
So what you're telling me, it's a cheat sheet. So when the doctor says, "I'll be right back," he's running to his office.
Yeah, I have
out
the short
book.
version of it in my office, and I just sort of flip it really quickly like that. There you are.
Exactly. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Very interesting. And I'm now curious to hear what Dr. Rice has to say.
I can just sit here. Yeah, I have a red bar. So I guess the big question that we have as far as the general population goes is, you know, are people willing to get in autonomous aircraft? And everybody has an opinion on this. The airlines have their opinion. They'd love to do this, obviously, get rid of pilots and save money. The pilots have an opinion. They don't like it for obvious reasons. Aircraft manufacturers have an opinion. They can design the airplane differently. The FAA and the other government agencies have an opinion as well. And everybody you meet on the street has an opinion. But basically what our lab has been doing for the past 10 years is tapping into the general population. We've run over 700 research studies, tapping into over 1 million different participants from over 50 different countries in order to look at the big data, to look at, you know, what people are really thinking about this, and are they willing to fly an autonomous aircraft, or even remote control aircraft, or even a mixed cockpit where you might have one human pilot in the cockpit and then another human pilot on the ground that can take over in a remote control situation. What I'm going to do very briefly is just talk about 3 of these studies that we've run to give you an idea of what the general consensus is on this topic. So in this first study, we looked at U.S. participants and folks from India as well. And over time since this study, we've also expanded this to other Asian countries and found that India fairly well represents the Asian continent for the most part, except for the Middle East. They think differently from the rest of East Asia. In this study, we offered people a hypothetical situation where you might either have 2 human pilots in the cockpit, or you have a fully autonomous aircraft, or you have an aircraft that's being flown by remote control where you have human pilots on the ground managing the aircraft. And then we also manipulated who was on board. So it was either you're on board as a participant, or your colleague is on board, or your child is on board the airplane, because obviously this makes a difference in people's minds depending on who is actually going to be flying. So if we look at the data here, what we see very quickly is that people like having human pilots in the cockpit. They feel safe because of that, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in the third study about why that is the case. And then the other thing you'll notice right away is that when you're talking about an autonomous airplane or a remote control airplane, Americans in particular are not happy about this. They really are not willing to fly in these aircraft. And these numbers reflect that. But on the other hand, Indians are not so much negative about it. They tend to be slightly negative, but they're more easily won over by the concept, and follow-up studies have shown that much of the reason for that is that Indians are more tech savvy. They tend to trust their government more, being a community-oriented society. They tend to be willing to do what others are willing to do as well, and follow along with that. So their views are not nearly as bipolar as Americans. And by bipolar, I mean, you know, the extreme, I'm willing if there's humans, and I'm not willing if there's not. So in another study, again, we looked at Americans and Indian consumers, and here in this situation, we compared having 2 human pilots in the cockpit versus 2 remote control pilots versus a mixed cockpit where you have 1 human in the cockpit and 1 remote control pilot on the ground. And we also manipulated whether the flight was going to be a commercial flight, a corporate flight, or a cargo flight. And for the corporate flights, we did actually tap into participants who do regularly fly corporate. So this wasn't just your average Joe on the street. This is somebody who had the money and the means to be able to fly corporate aviation. And then cargo, we're looking at people, who are sending their packages, Amazon or whatnot. So if you look down at the bottom right first on the commercial aircraft, you again see that bipolar view of Americans. When you have 2 humans in the cockpits, they love it. When it's remote control, when it's, remote control completely and there's nobody in the cockpit, then they're very, very negative about that. Indians, again, not nearly as bipolar. In fact, here you don't see much negativity at all. So you would suspect that perhaps they would be willing to fly an aircraft that is fully remote control. If you look at your top right here, you look at corporate aircraft. It's kind of a mirror of the commercial aircraft. The same bipolar views from Americans, the same sort of positive, neutral feelings from Indians. But the interesting one is the cargo aircraft, the third graph there. Everybody's quite positive about having 2 humans in the cockpit. A mixed cockpit is okay, and nobody's really negative about having it being fully remote control. And in other studies, we've looked at that. Also, fully autonomous seems to be okay with that. Because here's the bottom line. If you're not in the airplane, you're not going to die when it goes down. What do you care if your packages crash on the way to grandma for Christmas? That's the comments that we keep getting from participants is, I don't care, there's no danger to me. And then in the third study here, we're focusing on human consumers, and what we're interested in is what is going on in their heads. Why are they making these decisions not to fly or to fly? And some folks feel it might be a cognitive thing. They're thinking through this and they're coming to a logical conclusion. But what we found is actually the opposite. It's a very emotional reaction. And so what we did was we compared human pilots to a fully autonomous aircraft again. And we tapped into the participants' emotions and see, what they're feeling at the time. And this is how we did it. So you'll probably recognize these are your 6 universal emotions that all cultures appear to share. And what we did was we presented these faces to participants one at a time and asked them to rate on a scale of 0 to 100, how strongly do you feel like this face? So you have, anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. And so they rated them one by one, and then we used a bootstrapping model in order to test, which one of these might be significant mediators of willingness to fly. And if you look at the bottom graph first, you'll see, again, human pilot great, autopilot not so good as far as willingness to fly ratings that the participants provided us. But the top graph is where it gets interesting. So here's your 6 different emotions. When you take the humans out of the cockpits, anger goes up, disgust goes up, fear goes up a lot, sadness goes up, and surprise goes up. And surprise not being a negative emotion, but certainly not a positive one either. On the other hand, when you have the human in the cockpit, happiness goes up, so it flips on happiness. So definitely all 6 of these emotions are being touched on when participants are trying to make this decision whether or not they're willing to fly in a fully autonomous aircraft. And what we found is that the significant mediators are anger, fear, and happiness. So when you present somebody with a scenario where they're going to be on a fully autonomous airplane, they either get angry or fearful or both. And if you talk about flying on a normal flight with 2 humans in the cockpit, they're very happy about that. So the conclusions that we've come to, with these studies and also with many hundreds of other studies that we've published, is that people are basing their judgments on their emotions. It's basically how they feel at the time. And what we would like to look at in the future is, are we able to educate them? Are we able to bring them to a state where they're no longer letting their emotions rule their decision making and they can make a more cognitive, rational choice? So that's...
So one quick question,
Sure.
Not so quick. Well, a few comments. So from your presentation, we've just learned 3 things. 1, Middle Easterners think differently. 2, we have no concern for our colleagues. And,
That's true, yeah.
and 3, something my wife, who's British, would agree with, Americans are bipolar.
And that's probably
So those are
true
the
as
three
well.
takeaways.
Right.
So if we combine those and we actually sit there and say, okay, what does this really mean for this industry going forward, i.e. what the two of you have just said, and I'll ask Dr. Rice first, what does this mean for an autonomous, UAV or whatever we're calling them, drones here?
Right. So I think really the key that the consumers are telling us is that they're not ready to start with commercial aviation or corporate aviation. They would really like to see it start with cargo. Run a 5-year trial run in, say, some remote part of Alaska, let them see how safe it is, and then once the safety record is there, then the public will become more educated on that and become more willing to fly. Of course, all bets are off if you have a spectacular crash.
Okay, and then Martin, let me ask you the same question. Everything you just said, what does that mean for the drone industry going forward? Or what does it mean for the introduction of these vehicles for society?
Is this on, by the way? Do I have to do something? You can use this one if you want. Okay. Since I can't answer that question, I'll try to answer a different question, okay? I just wanted to make a comment about what Dr. Rice said. The fact is that my experience is that it's almost impossible for people to rationally get rid of concerns, okay? If we were rational people, I tell my patients, first of all, I'd be out of business. That's the first thing, okay? But the fact is that we can never reason significant fears in some way. What we do, believe it or not, the primary indicator of how comfortable we feel doing something is how often we do it. And so really the fact is that I like the idea of starting with, as you said, Dr. Rice, starting with doing non-manned flights, in other words, transporting material from one part to another.
Cargo.
Okay, cargo, non-living things, and essentially for people to get used to that idea. And as they get used to that idea, it starts to feel more safe to them. I tell my patients all the time who are afraid of flying, I just want you to think of yourself as baggage that breathes, okay? That's what I want them to do, okay?
Well, and it's interesting. Somebody's asked a question, and I thank them for bringing this up because you've just touched upon something. You're talking about getting used to something by exposure. Elevator. When the elevator first came in, people were scared what of it. And for many years, they had elevator operators when they didn't need them just to make people feel more comfortable. So can we use the history of the elevator and society's reaction to that as a proxy for what might happen here?
Not just the elevator, but a lot of things. Actually, elevator is a very poor example for exposure because it's very short. Usually we stay in an elevator for maybe anywhere from 10 seconds to a minute. And that's not enough time for a person to start to habituate to their fear reaction. But I could use that as an example. Just the fact is that we step into an elevator now like most of us step into a shower. We just don't think about it at all. And I think that's a great example.
And Dr. Rice, do you have any thoughts on that? Habituation, people get used to the elevator, they get used to the risk, and they see it's okay. It's normal. People's fears decrease. Can that happen in this scenario or not?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know about the habituation part or how long it takes for somebody to panic. But I certainly think that, short flights maybe would be a good way to start for folks. Very short flights, puddle jumpers like Daytona Beach to Orlando kind of stuff. And then once you get comfortable with that, move into the longer flights.
Let me ask you this. So there's some people who are never going to get comfortable with this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my uncle is an Air Force pilot who flew in Vietnam for, 6 or 7 years, and his wife, my aunt, will not fly. It's really weird. I mean, she knows it's safe. She knows they never crash, but she's just absolutely never going to get into it.
Well, who was the actress who said that if God wanted us to fly, he would have never invented the Pullman? It's that sort of thing, yeah.
Yeah.
In the classic John Madden, I only traveled to NFL games via train, who was very vocal about his fear of flying.
Right.
And he admitted he thought it was irrational, but it didn't matter. He was going to enjoy the train.
Yeah. And in 5-10 years, it may not really matter for those folks. They may not need to fly anymore. I mean, if you have driverless cars, you basically just get in your car, go to sleep, watch a movie, wake up, in another city 8 hours later. So they're hoping for that day to arrive very quickly, I would imagine.
So let's go to some questions that more folks in the audience have asked. Let's see. Let's start with the top one. One of the main benefits of autonomous flight is reduced separation efficiency. Does that leave room to continue having pilots and the resultant reassurance? Essentially, what they're saying is technology will make the pilot obsolete, but do we still have a pilot like we have an elevator operator when we didn't need them?
Well, I think it's a great analogy. I assume, that the next generation will have much less difficulty getting on autonomous flights and on autonomous cars than we might in some way. I was commenting, I just bought a car that does a good bit of its own driving once you're on the highway. And I was showing out to my granddaughter, who was 11, and she looked and says, "Oh, okay." I thought it was
mobile phones.
There was another really good question about females. Can I answer?
Yeah,
that?
that's the next one I wanted, because first of all, somebody was brave enough to put their initial there, but I think it's a very good question as well. Why don't you try and answer it?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a lot of data on this, and typically with any autonomous vehicle, including airplanes, cars, taxis, whatnot, we find that female participants are less willing across the board, and it's quite a dramatic difference between men and women. And we've looked at it in great detail to find out why it is the case that women are less willing, and it tends to boil down to a few factors that mediate that relationship. The first one is that men view it as being more fun. Men view it as being more cool, so there's the cool factor, there's the fun factor, and there's also the factor of knowledge about automation and autonomous agents and autonomous vehicles, and men tend to have more knowledge in general about that. Now, this is not to say that women don't know anything about automation. They certainly do. Many of them do. But we're looking at averages across the entire population. And so this isn't really an emotional issue. It's more of how they view it. If you talk to a guy about, riding in a driverless car or a driverless airplane, they think, "Oh, that'd be cool. It's like skydiving. Let's go do it." And women don't seem to have that same feeling.
Can I just make a comment on that? Sure. Some of the first epidemiological data, getting back to that word, showed that there was almost 2 to 1% increase women having anxiety disorders over men. As that data has been refined, it's probably true that women were more willing to cop to their fears, and right now the gender ratio is almost 50-50. Certainly it's 50-50 in some of the larger anxiety disorders, okay? Just want to let you know that. So could be, and listen, not your research, but it could be it's also an artifact of the measure.
And Dr. Rice, well, the comment you just made essentially inferred that men have more exposure to that kind of technology, therefore more comfort with that kind of technology. As we take a look at the population more broadly and take a look at the millennials and younger folks, where women are, almost all of them are working, and they're much more, they've been educated much more without a focus on women should do this and men should do that. It's more along the lines of what are your interests and do what you feel you're going to pursue. So a lot of them have pursued engineering degrees in STEM and whatnot. Is that reality going to change? Are women, is that going to become more equal? What you just said right now is that, well, men are more that way. Maybe it's going to level out as women as they get older and more comfortable.
Well, I certainly think it should go in that direction. Right now the gender roles are much more bipolar, I guess is another word I would use for elderly people, but for the younger generation, the millennials, and particularly the teenagers of today, not so much. However, it's still the case that fathers buy their sons trucks and toys that involve those kinds of spatial tasks and understanding of automation, and they don't do the same for their daughters. And until those gender roles are changed at that very early age, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change over time.
Okay, that's good. I want to ask a follow-up on another question here, and it's the second one down. How does the data about perception of autonomous aircraft follow data on perceptions of autonomous autos, i.e., if autonomous autos come first, is it going to make our job in aviation easier, or are they two different animals?
Right, so we have a lot of data on this. We've collected data on autonomous cars as well. Basically, the bottom line is that people are much more willing to get into an autonomous car than they are into an autonomous airplane. And when we ask them why that's the case, they say because if something goes wrong with the car, it'll just pull over to the side of the road and stop. When something goes wrong with the airplane, it just falls out of the sky. And obviously, we all in the aviation industry know that that's foolishness, that it's much safer to fly than it is to drive a car. There's 35,000 people are killed every year in cars. That number doesn't seem to be going down. But the general population has it in their head that cars are safer, therefore autonomous cars are safer than autonomous
So
airplanes.
the second part of another question is, why is that the case?
Well, can I comment on that? Yet no fear of driving. Actually, the people who are afraid of driving that I see are not afraid of dying in an accident. They're afraid of various other aspects of driving, which we don't need to get into right now. Most people, for example, let's go back to people afraid of flying. They know that it is safer for them to fly from point A to point B than to drive from point A to point B. And I tease them with that. I say, listen, when you get in the car, before you get in your car, do you put up on a lift and ask a certified mechanic to check the brakes and transmission and steering? And they laugh and they say, no. So they know, but that doesn't affect their fear. And that's the beginning of therapy. Why am I more afraid of something that is less dangerous and less afraid of something that is more dangerous? And that's the challenge that your industry has in terms of getting people on autonomous airplanes.
Yeah, and our participants are telling us it's because they can get out of the car at any time.
Which we know is really just not true based on
Right.
statistics. Everybody says that.
Right.
They say that about people who are afraid of flying, say that also, even though they know that it's a faux argument.
Right.
It's the imagined attempt to have control over something that they don't have control over.
So essentially, it's our imaginations are giving us, to use, Martin, your term, anticipatory anxiety, which is something I get before I go home every night because I know I'm going to get yelled at for something I didn't do.
Probably for good reason.
At least in my mind, I didn't do it.
This is interesting that even here among folks in aviation is still 51% no.
By the way, since I've been invited, I've asked every single one of my patients, would you fly on an autonomous plane? And most of them laugh at me, okay? But no one has even considered the question as a serious question.
Interesting, because of course it is a serious question. And that's what, hopefully, in the future, you're going to come back and tell us that indeed we've solved the problems because we approach it from this angle.
That's just my little neck of the woods, that's all.
So time's up, and but I just want to, is there a question or two in the audience that was not sent in via the app that you would like to ask? Old-fashioned, human question. Okay, well that seems to work. Oh, we got one, right in the middle right there. If somebody would mind getting, there's a microphone right there.
Actually, it's more just a comment because I just walked in the door and I just wanted to say to the gentleman who thinks that he didn't do something wrong, just suppress that feeling. You probably did something wrong, and your life will be so much better if you just go along with it.
You know, the problem is that I'm
Little
accused
advice.
of suppressing all my feelings, so therefore that just makes the matter worse. We have fun here, and we'll leave it at that, and hopefully we'll have, we got one more question.
Yeah, I just threw it in. I work in self-driving cars, and it's been very interesting to see how people adapt to them extremely quickly and, in fact, become more confident even than the engineers. So I want to ask this somewhat cynical question, which is the surveying we're doing today, is it about as useful as a survey in 2003 about what are you going to do with your iPhone, which will be released in 5 years? Right? People didn't know, even other phone manufacturers didn't understand it. So can we really learn that much right now?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And interestingly enough, trust in automation went way up in 2006, which was the introduction of the iPhone. Before that, everybody thought automation sucked, the blue screen of death, everything was crashing, and then suddenly you had something that worked all the time and it just worked. And so now I believe that since 2006 and over time, the trust in automation is definitely going up, and it should keep going up. Whether our surveys today are reliable for the future, it's hard to say. Probably not. You're probably right about that, but that's the only way that we can get the voice, of the consumers out there.
Okay, one more?
Has there been any research done with people to say if the cost was significantly less, to fly on a single pilot or autonomous aircraft, and then what their response would be?
Yeah, that was actually the first paper I published. We offered them a half-price discount, and willingness to fly went up.
And what the result was?
Well, the problem is you can't keep giving them half price forever, so at some point that's got to go away. It's the same thing that Uber did in Pittsburgh. They were offering free rides, and everybody's like, sure, free ride, I'll get on. But eventually the free ride has to stop, and then you have a problem. If you haven't already converted the population to your point of view, then you're not going to after that.
So what you're essentially saying is that we're all, well, never mind, I'm not going to say it. Essentially, we don't change is really what you're saying.
Not so much.
Yeah, again, I won't go there. Okay. So thank you. Appreciate it. And these gentlemen will be available afterwards if you have any questions for them that you're a little too uncomfortable asking in front of everybody. So thank you.